Beautiful. All right. Thank you everybody so much for joining us today. Our first presentation of 2023. It's very exciting. We're going to be reviewing some information if you've attended previous presentations, some information about just the basic differences between high school and post-secondary and getting accommodations. And then we're going to go a little bit deeper into the interactive process, which is our process in post-secondary that we go through for determining students' accommodations and how to really equip students with the skills to be ready for that interactive process, because it does heavily rely on their input. So we are going to get going with that today. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat. You can unmute yourselves if it relates to, the topic we're discussing on that slide. If you'd rather wait to the end, that is okay too. All right, so my name is Julia. I am the Assistant Director of the Educational Access Center here at Boise State. So I support students in accessing their education through accommodations. I do some coaching support for our students that are on the autism spectrum. And then I also get to do fun trainings and presentations like this with you all, our other high school partners, and across our campus with faculty and staff. So I'll let Erin introduce herself.
As I've said at all of our other trainings that we've done, I love to follow Julia because we do very similar things. So like Julia said, meet with students to establish those accommodations through the interactive process, outreach with faculty and the community to educate about, students with disabilities and support the effort for inclusion and accessibility here. And then I'm also working with our Raven Scholars here at U of I, doing some coaching and having some discussions about self-advocacy and how to access their accommodations and best communicate with their instructors. And I'm going to throw it over to Jamie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie. I'm a graduate assistant with the Educational Access Center. I'm also a part of a program that is offered through the Educational Access Center called TRIO ACES, which is academic coaching and educational support. So I do more one-on-one skill development, really whatever the student is wanting. We work on time management. Sometimes it's just a check-in, someone to talk to, can refer them to clubs on campus. We do a lot of, basically I'm their coach. So just helping them get through college, any hardships that they face, we can talk about them. It's not therapy, but it is more just someone to talk to about college and what resources are on campus. So it's definitely a great program. So then moving on to who we are. So the Educational Access Center, the EAC, is the Disability Resource Center at Boise State University, and then the Center for Disability Access and Resources, CEDAR, they're the Disability Resource Center at University of Idaho. And so what we do is we provide academic accommodations for students who may have temporary or permanent disabilities. So these accommodations will reduce and or remove barriers to a student's academic experience. So these disabilities can include, but are not limited to, learning disabilities, physical disabilities, mental health related needs. It's like ADHD, anxiety, depression. So those are more the mental health. And then the learning disabilities and physical disabilities, so dyslexia or actual physical disabilities. And then almost all trade schools, community colleges, and four-year universities have an office or at least a person to help with disability accommodations. A good rule of thumb, if the school accepts federal funding, is FAFSA eligible, they have to provide these accommodations for students.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. So really, when we are looking at these differences, when it comes to high school and transition programs, it's really team focused, right? Your IEP team, your 504 team. And that's determined and protected by IDEA. And really those IEPs and those 504s, it guarantees that success, right? We're saying with this plan, the student, should be graduating high school or will get to graduate high school. Whereas in post-secondary, we don't necessarily have individual plans that are team-based. We have accommodation letters, and these are protected by ADA, and it's all about access through reasonable accommodations. So removing or reducing those barriers so that students have access to their education and have access to success. And with this process, we don't get to hear from schools what students are coming in who had IEPs in high school, what students are coming in who have 504s in high school. It's very different. In K-12, the school identifies students and initiates services. The schools are notified if a student is transferring in and has an IEP, right? In college, it's up to this individual student to identify themselves. We even run into the case that when students request services, sometimes their parents complete the request for services for them, which, okay, yes, you can support the student, but it's still up to the student that even after they reach our office, if they'd like to have accommodations and if they're going to choose to have accommodations in their courses. So they really have to identify and make that choice with our support. Again, in K-12, students, especially with those IEPs, have those 3-year eligibilities, those 3-year reevaluations. Any updated testing is done by the school. We don't provide any testing. Maybe a university health services might be able to do anxiety, depression, or other mental health related assessments, or maybe some ADHD assessments, but it's not up to the Disability Resource Center to provide or complete diagnostic assessments. So the student is responsible for getting any necessary updated documentation or testing to our office. Again, a big theme, especially of tonight, I think, as we talk about the interactive process, is in high school, parents and families are typically highly involved, right? We want and we value family participation and parent participation in their students' education. And that's a big shift for students. That's a big shift for families once students move into post-secondary ed, because in post-secondary ed in colleges, parents will only have access to what students allow. So anytime a parent is joining an intake meeting with me, I always make sure I have the student's permission that the parent can join, making sure that it's the student okay with that decision. Releases of information are necessary for if parents can have access to things, but even then there's only so much information that can be shared. So for example, if a parent has a release of information and calls me and asks, what were my students' grades last semester? We don't even give students what their grades were over the phone from our registrar's office. But that's an example of information that I wouldn't be able to provide. If a parent called and asked me, is my student using their accommodations? Did they request their accommodations? I would welcome that family member to have that conversation with their student. Or I would ask the student first if they're okay with me disclosing that information. And then the big difference, I talked about that team aspect. We have IEP teams, 504 teams, these multidisciplinary team decisions that are happening regarding the student's plan, their services, their accommodations. When we get to post-secondary, it's the student and it's their Disability Resource Center specialist or their coordinator. And they're working together to figure out the reasonable accommodations. And then it's up to the student to decide if they'd like to request their accommodations for their classes each semester. I will let Erin talk more about accommodations.
There was one question in the chat, which I just want to talk about really fast. So the question was asked, how current does the IQ need to be for services? And I answered, Julia, you can say if you have anything different, but ideally we would like the most recent psychoeducational report or your eligibility evaluation. The most recent one from K through 12 would work.
Yep. Most recent is ideal. And IQ doesn't always need to be a part of that, depending on the student's disability and the accommodations they're asking for.
All right. Okay, so accommodations overview. So what accommodations do, as Julia said in the last slide, they reduce and or remove barriers to the academic experience. So an example of this could be using audiobooks instead of reading, or recording a lesson and lecture to support notes. They're intended to act as supports and or tools. They are reasonable and appropriate, and they depend on the class and the class requirements. So sometimes when accommodations are requested, we're gonna review them on a case-by-case basis to see if it makes sense for the course. We reach out to instructors and faculty to make sure that, you know, we are not making any fundamental alterations to their courses by providing those accommodations. But accommodations do not provide modifications to the course content or requirements. And that kind of goes back to what I just said. If there is some type of special circumstance, we do work collaboratively with faculty to ensure that we are not altering the course, but that we are still supporting the student. We also, accommodations don't provide specialized instruction, and the way that you could get some specialized instruction, not specialized instruction, but more support would be our academic services on campus, like tutoring, academic coaching. There's lots of resources, TRIO, that we have on all campuses to be able to kind of fill in some of those gaps too. And then accommodations do not apply to all classes. For all accommodations, some classes may not require specific accommodations. So the best example I can think of that I think a lot of people can understand is if you're taking a yoga class, you wouldn't need like extended time on a test because you're not going to be testing in yoga. There's obviously like many other different things that like a specialized one that I would say like a remote attendance. I'll talk about a fundamental alteration. So like a remote attendance, which is, in my opinion, a little rare, but having that be applied to some agricultural class where you need to be doing something with animals and you need to be in person. So we can't provide that type of accommodation if it's going to adjust that curriculum. I'm gonna go on to them. There we go. Okay. Shift in accommodation expectations. So these are some examples of what you might see a student having in K through 12, and then how that would look in post-secondary education. So looking at number 1, Kelsey has a designated peer she sits next to in math class. That peer takes notes for Kelsey and helps her with classwork when needed. The way that that could be accommodated in post-secondary education would be note-taking tools and technology. So Kelsey can attend tutoring at the Math Learning Center. That's available for all students on campus as well. So that's going back to those academic resources that are across campus, in addition to that note-taking tool to kind of bring that all together and bridge those gaps there. And then number 2, Troy gets up to a week extension on all assignments. Something that you might see in post-secondary education would be access to readings, assignments in advanced, or occasional extensions on assignments, deadlines up to 48 hours. Number 3, Maria gets extra time on quizzes and exams, and time is unspecified. And in post-secondary education, most common extended time would be for time and a half. And then accommodations, again, are here to reduce and remove barriers. They don't guarantee success.
And I would even add too, like within these accommodations, for example, the occasional extension on assignment deadlines, it's not one that's given out super frequently. And there's typically parameters around it. For example, up to 48 hours. A lot of the time professors will say, if it involves any kind of peer work or group work, then no, because then it's now impacting someone else's learning. So for example, if you need to post to a discussion board that peers are expected to respond to within 2 days, if you're posting late, your peers can't respond within that 2 days. So that now that's impacting their access to their education as well. So even with some of these accommodations, there may be specific guidelines depending on the class that we need to follow as well. Yeah, anything else you'd add, Erin?
That was a good one, and I should have added that. So thank you.
So when we talk about the interactive process, this is really where a lot of these questions that we talk about regarding the student, their disability, how it impacts their learning, where we like to get a lot of information from the student and hearing from them. And so we really focus around 3 parts to this process: the student self-report, observation and interaction, information from external parties. So that student self-report is the student's ability to describe, in whatever way is equitable or accessible for them, their experience of their disability, their barriers, and the effective or even ineffective accommodations. This is really important, and we put a lot of weight on this because we love for students to be able to say, this is how I'm impacted by my learning. So for example, note-taking. What part of note-taking is difficult? And asking further questions, which I'm not going to go far into because I know Erin's going to go into it. But asking the student questions about some of those barriers, and also not even just the barriers, but some of their strengths, and how can we utilize their strengths to make that part of the tools or the accommodations that we're doing. We also look at our observations and interactions with the student. So for example, we're talking a lot about the interactive process. We're talking a lot about how it falls on it, the responsibilities on the student. So if a parent attends the initial intake meeting with their student, which again, if the student allows it, that's totally fine. But is the parent doing most of the talking, or is the student able to advocate for themselves as well? If the parent's doing most of the talking and we redirect the questions to the student, is the student able to talk about their experience? Another example is anxiety. Anxiety is very common with many of our students who are accessing accommodations. And if a student's telling me, I had a student today telling me about their anxiety, and I just happened to glance down and they had my business card, so it had my fax number on it, and they had been crinkling it up the whole time, and that was a sign where I was like, yes, the student's visibly anxious right now. And little things like that, just those personal interactions we look at to help validate the student's self-report. And then the third one is documentation. So with the documentation, this can look like a variety of things. So when that question was asked of how current does the IQ need to be, a student with ADHD who's asking for extra time on quizzes and tests, it's not really necessary for me to see the student's IQ. So that would be a sense where maybe that piece of documentation isn't really necessary. And so we like to have the most up-to-date information, but it varies. So examples of documentation could be a 504 plan, an IEP, the high school summary of performance. It could be a letter from a mental health counselor if the student goes to counseling. It could be a neuropsych from their physician, from a doctor. So it really varies and depends on the accommodations the student needs. I will say typically for more medically based disabilities, we would likely look at it from their primary care doctor or things like that. If it's more educational based and the student had an IEP or 504, a lot of the time that's sufficient. Going back to Erin's example of being able to attend class remotely, that's a very rare accommodation that is typically approved and able to be done in courses just because it may alter the course requirements. And so documentation for that would be like information from the provider, whoever's treating the student, saying these are the reasons why the student absolutely cannot attend in-person classes. And that would be an example of more extensive documentation. But for some of the most higher frequency or more common accommodations, typically the 504 plans and IEPs are sufficient if the student has it. Would you add anything to that, Erin?
I would just say, well, at the University of Idaho, we really push for the evals and the psychoed report. So the IEPs are like one piece that we look at, but we're really looking for that that diagnostic and that signature from a psych and things like that.
Thank you. Jamie.
So now we will talk about the process for receiving accommodation. So of course, first you have to be admitted to that post-secondary school, be enrolled there. And then you will find the post-secondary school's disability services, either the website or the office on campus, up to you if you want to do it in person or online, get started online, or have a person do it with you. And then completing the request for services form, which that is typically online. And so these are some things that are normally asked on that form. So demographic and contact information, the name of the disability that the student has been diagnosed with or disabilities, describing how that disability impacts their learning, previous and or desired accommodations, and then applicable documentation. So like Julia and Erin stated, those documentations, mostly the evals from a psych or IEP 504, whatever you can get that has that diagnosis. But typically the eval is that has the diagnosis on there is what is desired. And then disability services office, the office for them will contact you or the student to set up an initial appointment after they have been set up with a coordinator and that coordinator has been assigned to them. So that's the process for receiving them. And then in the initial appointment, these are things that the student should be prepared to talk about. So discussing their disability and how it impacts them in academics. So if that's accessing class materials, if they need extra time, like that 48 hours of having extra time, or you can even have, I had one student who needed the module opened up a little bit earlier so that they had more time to review homework and assignments and have more time to work on it. Test taking, whether that's in a one-person room, a silent room, kind of depending on what test taking needs they need. The classroom testing environment, note taking, do they need speech to text, text to speech, whatever accommodation they need for that. And then housing. So is there accessible furniture that they need, medical technology needing set up, or emotional support animals, things like that. And then, of course, providing that documentation if it has not been submitted already. And if they don't have that documentation, then they can learn what documentation is required in order to send it in, because documentation is required. Then discussing previous accommodations and how beneficial they were to their learning, as well as what Julia said of discussing what hasn't worked for them in the past. Maybe one of their extra time, like I'm sure that worked for them, but maybe it didn't. Like some of the accommodations could just not be for them. And so it'd be important to discuss how they were a barrier, or like this says, how beneficial they were, and if that can be implemented, and if it's an accommodation that post-secondary school even offers, because like we've mentioned, not all accommodations can transfer from K through 12 to post-secondary. And then of course, the student should be able to ask any questions that they need answered, and see if there's any other resources on campus that they need to support them. So.
Knew I had an examples of documentation slide, so I shouldn't have gone so in depth 3 slides before, but it's okay. Here it is again, just some examples of documentation. And Erin really did bring up a good point. How she said, for example, University of Idaho, they really want to see that 3-year reevaluation and the most recent kind of diagnostic data and assessments. So one of the unfortunate things about post-secondary schools is we are not across the nation, across the state, we're not consistent with what deems appropriate or applicable documentation. It really depends on that interactive process and those three parts to it of how relevant and how valuable the documentation will be. So really making sure that, I guess my best advice when it comes to documentation is having the student contact the Disability Resource Center of their preferred schools and say, this is what I have going on. These are what my accommodations look like. What could my accommodations look like in post-secondary, and what information will you need? And truly see what individual schools, because the standard is all of us require documentation, but to the extent and how comprehensive we need it is what's going to vary. So thank you for bringing that point up too, Erin.
And just something to add to that too, with the interactive process and documentation, and Julia and Jamie have both said this, it's really important that, I mean, we really rely heavily on the interactive process. So if the documentation is not there at the beginning, we're able to work with students to help them find resources to be able to get what they need so that our office can help them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's Erin, is your guys' practice one or two, up to 1 or 2 semesters?
We will go up to 2 semesters. Yeah. I didn't know how much we were sharing of that. So
Yeah.
I thought that was like being kind of cryptic.
That's okay. We'll go up to 1 semester. And if the student doesn't have it within the semester, then we typically like to at least hear from them again, have another conversation with them, ask what's going on, and then we will likely approve them for accommodations for a 2nd semester without documentation, as long as we go kind of through a mini interactive process again. But then after that 2nd semester, we need the documentation to continue just legally.
Yeah. And so just to clarify, those grace periods that we're talking about and those semesters that we're giving those accommodations on like provisional status is really so that we can ensure that, you know, we are providing accessible learning and educations, and we're buying them some time to be able to get what they need. Mm-hmm. And for us, and I should know this, Julia, and I apologize, but at the University of Idaho, we have the Counseling and Testing Center, in which we have psychologists and psychiatrists who can diagnose for different disabilities and different mental health diagnoses. And I don't know if you guys have the same. Do you guys have?
Our health services can do assessment and evaluation for anxiety, depression, more common mental health diagnoses, mm-hmm. as well as screening for learning disabilities, mm-hmm. and they can do diagnostic assessments for ADHD. Okay.
Yeah. So I know that our CTC, our Counseling and Testing Center, has been really impacted in the last year or so. Mm-hmm. So those grace periods are also helping them to be able to get in and get tested and get all of their concerns answered and still feel supported through their education during that time.
Erin, your favorite slide.
Back to me. Okay. So again, the interactive process, so important. Something that students will, this is kind of like a mock-up slide that Julia, that we made just to kind of give you insight on what the interactive process could look like for students, and kind of some questions and clarifying questions that we ask. So a student might come in and say, in high school, I got double time on exams. And sometimes they're not really sure why they're getting certain accommodations. And I get it. I also came from the high school previously. So I have worked directly with those students, those who know exactly why they have their accommodations and those who don't really know. So something that we would ask to clarify about why they had double time on tests would be, how does extra time help you? What do you experience disability related? And so what we're looking for here is students sharing, you know, for example, if they have anxiety. They are telling us those symptoms that they get during testing. They're telling us, you know, what they're experiencing and what those barriers are that they have during that testing session. Another example would be, I got a copy of my teacher's notes. So some clarifying questions that we would ask, how does that help you? And it's so important for the student to be able to articulate why they got those notes and what is helping them. And so I think it's really important that, and I know a lot of you guys are doing this if you guys are teachers or case managers, but just understanding what type of learners the students are. I love when students will come in and say like, yeah, I'm an auditory learner. Like I have to hear it. Like, and I'm also a visual learner. So being able to like, for them to be able to speak to those things is really helpful for us too, and our access consultants to be able to really understand their history and education and why they have the things they have. And, you know, it helps us distinguish what we want to keep providing to them. Another thing that we might hear is, I struggle with reading. And then we would ask something like, are there tools you use to help you with reading? Have you used audiobooks? So just some things to kind of get their brain working. A question that I ask a lot is like, hey, when you watch a movie, do you watch movies with subtitles? And that'll be like, oh yeah, like all the time. I never watch movies without subtitles. And then that will tell me like, well, hey, like I might want to add closed captioning on here for, you know, teachers who are throwing up PowerPoints during lectures. Another example, I took tests in a separate room in high school. And then we would ask like, you know, why are you going to a separate room? What is the issue with the classroom environment? And, you know, we're going to hear answers like, I get really distracted by people clicking their pens or their water bottles dropping, or I get really anxious when people are finishing before me. And then I feel like I need to rush and get through my test. So those just like details that students can give us are just very helpful for us to provide them the best services that we can through our office. Anything you want to add to that, ladies?
And just say too, like, we understand that for students, this may be their first time where they're answering like this descriptive of questions. It may not, it may be their 10th time because they've done it in their IEP meetings and they're champs at it. But we understand that like they're meeting us for the first time and we're asking these fairly personal questions about their academic experience. And it's not that we're trying to be invasive, it's that we are trying to find, okay, you struggle with reading. So do you currently use access technology? Are audiobooks helpful? It's really that trying to like that solution focused mindset to say, okay, what are the tools and strategies you already know? And what are the ones, what can we further develop on? I just say that. Yeah. Jamie, is there anything you add?
I think you hit it on the nail.
Then Erin.
I forgot I was doing the slide. Hang on. All right, preparing students for the interactive process. So things that you guys can do now if you are working with students is just ensuring that they're meaningful participants in their IEPs or 504 team. Something that I saw this year that I thought was really awesome, and I hadn't seen it in my previous state that I was in, but I've been attending some IEPs locally, and they're having seniors present at their IEPs, their own transition plans, and kind of talking about, you know, their goals. And like I think it's really working on a skill. They're talking specifically about their disability and their or disabilities, and they're talking about their accommodations that they received and the supports they received through their schooling. And I sat in the first one and was like, this is amazing. This is like great practice for what they're about to come into in the spring when I meet with them. So I think just giving them more understanding, if they don't already have it, of why they have the accommodations that they do, and just really getting them to dive into like what kind of learners they are and what works for them and their strengths. Another thing too is like when students can tell me about what their strengths are, I feel like that's when I go into like problem solver mode, and I'm like, okay, cool. So we can do this and this, and there's like these different things. So definitely just providing them with the confidence, or coaching them up to have the confidence to talk about themselves and their experiences. Giving students opportunities to, I kind of just said that. So yeah, talking about their accommodations with all of you. Evaluate and identify how they learn different subjects. That's really important too. I think students who I'm going to be, and Julie, I don't know if I'm going to make a blanket statement. I don't know if it's going to be the same for you, but most students I am meeting with likely just hate math. And so they all really talk about how much they hate math, which is, common from the students I see. So, talking about their strengths in other areas and then how we can support them in their math and science classes, if that's something that they're not considering a strength. And then some additional learning opportunities with executive functioning, time management, organization, task initiation. That is all going to be super helpful for them when they transition to post-secondary. We also have resources on campus that can continue the support with executive functioning, as we know that can be a lifelong struggle for a lot of people. And then some other like mindfulness, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, studying and test taking strategies, and note taking techniques. I also think it would be great to get them to really start diving into some of the different types of apps that are provided, the free apps that are out there for lots of different things. We have for being able to have like different types of audio books. We have some different note-taking apps, recording apps that are out there that they can start practicing with. Anything else you want to add to that one?
No, that's great. Just utilizing the technology and understanding that they can still use it in post-secondary. It doesn't stop when they're in high school.
So now the timeline for requesting accommodation. So the spring or the summer before the first semester, the request for services form needs to be completed, as well as documentation should be submitted. And then meeting with the student's assigned access coordinator from the school's disability services center, which happens close to the time when the request for services form is submitted and processed. Takes a few days to do it, but they're always assigned, and then they can schedule an appointment. And then housing accommodation should be completed as soon as possible before housing is assigned. And then after course registration, so that normally happens during orientation, but the student will meet with the disability services again, just to see if they need to add any accommodations based on their classes, or maybe they don't need some accommodations, like we've mentioned before, some accommodations you don't need for specific classes, and then requesting accommodations for their individual classes. And then every semester, the student should meet with the disability services if any changes need to be made, if there's any complications with accommodations. Maybe they didn't work, maybe they didn't like them, just to check in and see if they need to be added or taken away. And then requesting accommodations for the next semester once the student is registered for classes. That, I actually recently learned this, happens every semester. So the student has to go in and request those services or those accommodations, because it could change. Maybe they don't need it this semester like they did last semester, depending on the accommodation. So that's the timeline.
All right. So I put in links to some advocacy tools that we have, and some transition resources. So for example, and then I'm also going to put a link to, if you want to share this with anybody, we record all of our presentations. We share links to the presentations. So I will put the document to our recorded presentations and those links in the chat as well. So you can access that. But on our website, on CEDAR's website, oh wow, I did not update the upcoming presentations portion of this. We have our advocacy tools. So some of the things that we discussed today, This has an activity you can do with students that really prepares them for the interactive process, as well as some cheat sheets on language that students may come across in their college search or when they're looking at their prospective universities. And then Cedar also has a Padlet too that talks about differences between supports as well as that preparing for the shift activity. So, are there any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat if you have any questions. I will stop recording.